We can also see that animals too are subject to deceptions and to corrigible misconceptions. What, then, does truth mean when it is totally different for animals and for ourselves, does not correspond with objective reality, and yet leads to the expected consequences with as much certainty as if it did so correspond? This seems to me explicable only by the following assumption. The difference in organization requires that each species, in order to survive and to attain its essential aims in life, must behave in a way that is distinctive and different from that of other species. Whether an action guided by a representation will have useful consequences cannot be determined by the content of this representation, even though it might correspond with absolute objectivity. The result will depend entirely upon what this representation can accomplish as a real process within the organism, allied with other physical and psychological forces and with reference to the specific needs of life. If we assert that man sustains and supports life only on the basis of true representations, and destroys it by false ones, what does this truth, the content of which is different for each species and which never reflects the true object, mean except that some representation associated with a particular organization and its powers and needs leads to useful results? Initially, truth is not useful because it is true, but vice versa. We dignify with the name of truth those representations that, active within us as real forces or motions, incite us to useful behavior. Thus there are as many basically different truths as there are different organizations and conditions of life. The sense perception that is true for the insect would obviously not be true for the eagle. This is because this perception, on the basis of which the insect acts properly in relation to inner and outer constellations, would move the eagle, in relation to his conditions, to unreasonable and destructive action. These perceptions do not lack normative stability. Indeed, every perceiving being possesses a generally established truth, which his representation may grasp or miss. The law of gravitation remains true whether or not we recognize it, in spite of the fact that it would not be true for beings with a different conception of space, different categories of thought, and a different system of numbers. The content that is true for us has the peculiar structure of being totally dependent on our mode of existence, since this is not shared by other beings, but its truth value is completely independent of its physical realization. On one side a being with its constitution and its needs, on the other side an objective existence is given, thus it is ideally established. What is the truth for this being? Since truth for this being means the most favorable representations, a selection takes place among its psychological processes. Those that are useful become fixed by the ordinary methods of selection and constitute as a whole the true world of representations. In fact, we do not have any other definitive criterion for the truth of a representation except that the actions based upon it lead to the desired consequences. Once these modes of representation have been finally established as expedient through selection and cultivation, they form among themselves a realm of theory that determines, according to inner criteria, the inclusion or exclusion of every new representation, just as the rules of geometry are built upon each other according to a strict inner autonomy, whereas the axioms and the methodological norms that make this whole structure possible cannot themselves be proved geometrically. The whole system of geometry is not valid at all in the same sense as are its single propositions. The latter can be proved by each other, whereas the whole is valid only in relation to something external, such as the nature of space, our mode of perception, and the strength of our ways of thinking. Individual judgments may support each other, since the norms and facts already established substantiate others, but the totality of these norms and facts has validity only in relation to specific physiopsychological organizations, their conditions of life, and the furthering of their activity. The objectivity of truth as well as of value viewed as a relation between subjective elements. The concept of truth as a relation of representations to each other, and not as an absolute quality of any one of them, is also confirmed in respect of a particular object. Cont asserts that to recognize an object means to bring unity into the multiplicity of perceptions. Out of the chaotic material of our images of the world and the continuous flux of impressions, we distinguish some as belonging together and group them in units, which we then designate as objects. An object has been perceived as soon as we have grouped into an entity the multitude of impressions that belong together. What else can this entity signify but the functional interdependence of those single impressions and materials of perception? The unity of these elements is nothing extraneous to the elements themselves. It is the persistent form of their relationship that they represent. When I recognize the object sugar by forming the impressions that pass through my consciousness, white, hard, sweet, crystalline, into a unity, this means that I conceive these contents of perception as bound together, that under the given conditions a connection or mutual interaction exists, that one quality exists at this point and in this relation, because the other exists, and so on reciprocally. In the same way as the unity of the social organism, or the social organism as a unit, signifies only the forces of attraction and cohesion among its individual members, so the unity of the single object, the perception of which is its intellectual realization, is only an interaction between the elements that enter into the perception of it. In what is called the truth of a work of art, the mutual relationship of its elements as against its relationship to the object that it depicts is also probably much more significant than is usually acknowledged. If we disregard the portrait, where the problem is more complicated owing to the purely individual theme, single elements in works of fine art or of literature will not convey an impression of either truth or falsehood. In isolation they stand outside these categories.